Hello there, welcome to a very special edition of Plus Talk on Plus Life, where we're all about turning positive into a plus. Today we are talking stigma and the state of HIV stigma here in the United States. Joining me to tell us where we're at with things is DaShawn Usher. He is the Senior Director of Communications of Color and Media at GLAAD. Good to see you, DaShawn. Thanks for doing this.
Good to see you too, Carl.
So, DaShawn, I know that this is the fifth year GLAAD has done this report. And before we get into what the report shows, tell us a bit about the report itself.
Yeah, so GLAAD's annual State of HIV Stigma report is a American opinion around HIV stigma. And so it measures like awareness and knowledge and perceived stigmas for people living with HIV across the US.
So why did GLAAD feel that this was information that we should know about? Why did GLAAD and Gilead partner to bring this report out?
You know how you know that stigma exists, but you really don't know how to measure it, or you don't know like where is it actually being reported. And so this report actually like gave us like that baseline of understanding of if we're trying to end the epidemic, what is it that else like needs to be considered? And HIV stigma is definitely one of those. And so with GLAAD and Gilead and that particular partnership, it was us coming together to decide that this is an important measure also when it comes to ending HIV.
Okay, well, let's start with the positives first. Where have there been improvements and why do those improvements matter?
Since we started doing the report, it seems to be significant achievements, such as a reduction in belief that HIV stigma exists. So from when we started in 2020, there was 89% of folks that believed HIV stigma still exists. And in 2024, there's 85%. Additionally, we know that like the stability and general knowledge about HIV across the US and inside the southern US is encouraging. So nearly 90% of Americans feel as if they know a little bit about HIV or feel knowledgeable about HIV.
Okay, so where is there room for improvement? What have we got to start doing better?
So yeah, there's still work to be done. And so it's always interesting while people still feel knowledgeable or feel as if they know a little bit about HIV, there's still what we're seeing this year and over like the last 5 years is that there's belief that everyone should get tested for HIV has dropped. And so I'm not sure if you recall, but there was the CDC recommendation that everyone should get an HIV test within their lifetime between the ages of 13 to 64. Most Americans are believing that that is not the case. And so it dropped from 77% in 2020 to 67% in 2024. And this decline is seen across all regions, which signal a need for like renewed advocacy and education efforts. I definitely do think that COVID impacted that. And so we do have to get our HIV testing numbers like back up and people feeling as if like that's something that they should do. And then also the belief that people living with HIV can live long, healthy lives has decreased, particularly in the US South. And so in 2020, that was 90%. And in 2024, we're seeing 85% of people believing that people living with HIV can live a long and healthy life.
Was there anything in the report, DaShawn, that sort of startled you in particular or took you by surprise that made you go, wow, I really wasn't expecting that?
Weird thing is no. And I say that because of the experience that I've had in direct service. And so it really is one of those things of where if you've been working in the field of like direct service or HIV prevention and treatment, some of this may seem as if like it feels on par with what you may have internally feel or what you may have seen or what you've experienced with like your clients or your participants. And so it feels as if it's kind of on the nose, but it's also one of those things I think that I never knew just how much HIV stigma existed and how much it played a role. And so this State of HIV Stigma report is really an important report for the field of HIV and public health, especially for those working in HIV prevention and care as a measure so that they can do something locally and take this data locally to do something with it.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think what startled me in the report was the approach that Gen Z has towards HIV, or as the report states, sort of lack thereof. In your mind, what's the best way to get Gen Z engaged so that they are taking notice of this and are helping end HIV stigma?
Yeah, so Gen Z continues to be among the least knowledgeable generations about HIV. And so only 37% of Gen Z adults are knowledgeable about HIV, which has been on par for the last 5 years. And so, again, I think part of it is that they're not seeing the storylines. And so they need, I think, like, again, media on all forms. There just needs to be increase in HIV stories and storylines. I think that's the start. If you think about how prevalent HIV awareness campaigns and corporations and supports and funds and like there was a point, like particularly during the 90s and early 2000s, where you couldn't escape like learning or hearing about HIV. And so I also think that local politics has played a role, as far as like if you're not able to talk about sexuality or sexual health inside of classrooms, and that's going out the door, so does like that information and the learning opportunity to learn about HIV. And so I think part of it is that we can't fault Gen Z to a certain degree, is that it really is up to us to educate and make sure that like they're getting that information. And I think that's where we actually have the biggest opportunity, right, to educate and to do it in a way that isn't as stigmatizing as it was, at least I know for myself growing up, where a lot of the HIV campaigns were fear based. Now we could have them fact based, right?
Yeah, I think it's interesting to your point, DaShawn. You mentioned there about sort of seeing on television and things like that. I know that the report mentions a significant decline in HIV positive stories and characters being shown across the media, with just one, I think, in prime time of last season, which was the TV show Fellow Travelers. Why do you think there has been a decline, not just in TVs and movies? We used to have shows like we had Pose, and we had storylines in Only Murders in the Building and Grey's Anatomy. You had people like me, an HIV positive journalist who was, on television more frequently. Why do you think in this sort of last 12 to 24 months that presence has declined and we're not seeing as much across all forms of media and in print too?
Yeah, I think part of it is that we've been seeing the decline and we've been seeing the challenges of, like, again, issuing challenges to studios and networks to tell more HIV storylines. We started doing those challenges about, I want to say, almost like 3, 4 years ago. With our work with Gilead, also because even then we saw that storylines were declining and that some of these HIV storylines were only on certain shows. And if that show went away, then you kind of have like this perfect storm of where there is no other shows that are like scripted that are talking about HIV, or movies. And we know how long it takes for a movie to develop, like where we aren't talking about HIV. And I know in one of our other reports, we'll talk about like our studio responsibility index report that'll come out later in the month. Also, will highlight like sort of kind of those missed opportunities for HIV storytelling. And so I think part of it is that we need more people inside of those writer rooms, but then also people that are executives, right? That will greenlit and actually see the value inside of these stories. Like there's so many possibilities, right? Of like where we could go with HIV storylines that deserve like the complexity, that deserves like the sensitivity, but also deserves the education and awareness that could happen with what we've learned now, versus it always being based in the past. And so I do think that there's opportunities to tell more stories around HIV.
Now, DaShawn, I know that GLAAD's Communities of Color team played an important role in this, and across the board, the Communities of Color team does a lot of work to make sure that voices are being heard and represented across all forms of media. Tell me about that team and why its role is so important for initiatives like this and other things you guys do at GLAAD.
Yeah, so with like GLAAD's Communities of Color and Media team, it's like one of the leading like forces of driving equitable and accurate representation of Black LGBTQ people and people living with HIV and queer communities of color in the realm of entertainment and media. And so one of the things that we want to do is continue to amplify the most marginalized voices, bring in like writers and other authors when it comes to like our research. And so this year we've been able to work with Matthew Rodriguez, who is a talented writer, an author and contributor that has worked inside of the field of HIV prevention and care also. And then our head of research, Tristan Marr, who is literally probably one of our greatest champions to really just make sure that like we're getting it right and how do we tell the stories, right? And so while we're collecting so much data, you also have to frame it, right? Of like how we're doing, what was the differences. And I think that was why particularly for this year's report, year 5, it was really taking that community 5-year retrospect perspective into like context and having Matthew write from a perspective as to, okay, this is all the data that we're seeing. These are the trends that we're seeing. How do we make this make sense to that person?
Well, again, DaShawn, congratulations. Thank you for doing this, and we'll put the report up on our socials as well, and probably somewhere there'll be a link down here, I think, is what the kids do. But DaShawn Usher from GLAAD, thank you very much for your time.
No, thank you.
That is going to do it for this Plus Talk. If you want more information or you want to check out the report, be sure to go to our website, pluslifemedia.com. We will have a link there. And remember, you can always like, follow, and share Plus Life. We are across your favorite social platforms at Plus Life Media. Until next time, be nice to one another. And if you haven't had an HIV test in a while, go get one. Bye-bye.